Good evening to all of you. My name is Akiner. I am the president of the Turkish Policy Center, and I'll be serving as the moderator of this panel this evening. On behalf of TPC, I would like to welcome all of you and thank you for coming here this evening, and thank especially our distinguished guests for joining us. Before we go into the details for today's event, I would like to briefly tell you a bit about TPC. We are a nonprofit 501c3. Our goal is to collect, analyze, study, and disseminate information related to political, economic, legal, and social developments in the Republic of Turkey, and to provide for the sharing of this knowledge. We are nonpartisan and believe in working towards a secular Turkey that is democratic, inclusive, tolerant, and transparent. I would like to thank our sponsor for today's event, United Minds for Progress, whose founder, Mr. Sezen Uysal, has joined us today. I would also like to welcome the Young Professionals in International Affairs Association, whose organization is well represented this evening. I would like to thank everyone who has given their continued support. Additionally, I would like to thank all those who assisted in making today's event a success, especially our new fellow, Lee Seeger. He's downstairs, I believe. Finally, I thank all of our members and board of directors. If you'd like to learn more about us, become a member of TPC, receive our emails, volunteer with us, or donate, please visit www.turkishpolicycenter.org. The title of today's event is Turkey-Syria Predicament, Finding a Way Forward. As you know, the ongoing civil war in Syria is having a significant impact on its neighbor Turkey. The UN estimates that over 1.6 million Syrian refugees have escaped to Turkey, a tragedy which has resulted in massive social and economic ramifications. Additionally, Turkey's actions, or lack thereof, vis-à-vis fighters and weapons allegedly crossing its borders have come under scrutiny. More recently, the developments in Kobane have resulted in Ankara drawing criticism from the international community and an explosion of violence on Turkish streets, threatening the government's peace process with its Kurdish population. Some of the questions we're looking forward to address today are: how will these developments affect Turkey's relations with the United States? Will there be a Turkish military incursion in Syria? How will Turkey's standing in the region be affected? What is Turkey's economic status quo, and how will it be impacted by the Syria crisis? What implications are there for next year's elections? What is the fate of the Syrian refugees? Is the Kurdish-Turkish peace process stalled? And if so, what is the way out? How can Turkey find a way forward with Kurds in neighboring Syria and Iraq? Joining us today to address these questions are Ambassador Robert Pearson, former U.S. Ambassador to Turkey and more recently President of the International Research and Exchanges Board; Dr. Soner Cagaptay, Director of the Turkish Research Program at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy; Dr. Sebnem Kalemli-Ozcan, Professor of Economics and Finance at the University of Maryland; Dr. Denise Natali, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University; and last but not least, Cenk, Founder and Director of Sidar Global Advisors. Again, welcome to all the panelists and thank you for joining us. So this is how the format's going to be. Each panelist is going to have 10 minutes to share their views, and after that we're going to go straight to Q&A from the audience. So without further ado, let's get started. Ambassador Pearson, would you like to start?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thank you to TPC for this event and to the sponsors. And first time I've been in the Goethe Institute, so it's a pleasure to be here as well. I do feel like we're a family of 6 at a 5-person table. So if we look a little crowded, it's because we all know each other and respect each other very well. I think if I had given this talk on Monday, it would have been different. But I believe Tuesday's elections and the control of the Senate by the Republicans will change American policy towards Syria and towards Turkey. And we don't know what those outlines are yet. The news media are talking as if it will be more aggressive. It will certainly be more assertive, but the outlines are yet to come. So I think that's the principal new point for this week to bring to the debate. I do think that it's always important to remember that Turkey deserves enormous praise for the work it has done in sheltering Syrian refugees. First time in Turkish history to receive this number of people across its own borders and to care for them for this period of time. And I think I've seen numbers as high as $3 billion for the cost of supporting these refugees. I know the U.S. has provided at least $1.5 billion in support of these refugees. It's an enormous burden, enormous social impact, and Turkey deserves great praise. I think in the current debate, Turkey is right about three things. It's right about Assad. Assad is a tyrannical dictator. No problem. Yes, indeed. Speaking to the mic. My mother always said she could hear me anywhere, so I presume that you would too. In any case, Turkey is right about three things. It's right about Assad. Assad is a tyrannical, ruthless dictator, killing his own people to maintain his place in power, and he should be on the slag heap of history. Turkey is absolutely right in its analysis of Assad. Secondly, Turkey does rightly recognize that there is a risk, a kind of paradoxical risk, that if Kobane is held, and we all hope that it is, that the PKK will gain a degree of stature that will complicate the peace process that Turkey's involved in with the PKK. And I don't know that there is much that can be done about that, but I think it has to be recognized by Americans who are thinking about the problem. Thirdly, I think the Turks are right when they say that American strategy is unclear. Americans say that American strategy is unclear, and if you could find a more complicated picture anywhere in recent history, I can't. And I think that the fact that the U.S. is determined to try to do something positive about the circumstance is the most important factor at this point, but I grant Turkey's observation that the policy is not yet clear. The U.S. is right about three things. It's right about the threat. ISIS will not stop on its own. And if it isn't stopped, it may destroy Iraq. Interestingly, this week for the very first time, and today for the very first time, the New York Times is reporting setbacks for ISIS. I saw one article earlier in the week on this point. Whether this is a trend or not, I'm not in a position to say. But if ISIS were to win, if ISIS were actually not only to win against its present enemies, but then turn its forces against Assad and win, then Turkey would be faced with a severe threat on its southern border, and the region would be threatened as well. And so the U.S. is right about the fact that there is a very substantial threat to the region, and something must be done about it. Secondly, the U.S. is right that the lead must come from the region. Why do you imagine that ISIS publicly executed an American journalist and then a British journalist, almost inviting the Western powers to involve themselves? And why would they do that? To recruit, to present themselves as the champions of Islam, to give themselves legitimacy superior to the legitimacy of the governments in the region. So why would the Americans fall into that trap? The solution to the regional issue belongs with people in the region. The Americans should be very happy to play their role, but the lead has to come from within. If Turkey doesn't take that lead, then it falls to others. It falls to Baghdad, it falls to the Peshmerga, it falls to the Iranians. So one of the issues for Turkey is, so would you rather have one of those other groups taking the lead in this issue, or do you think Turkey ought to be doing something more than it's doing now? Thirdly, Turkey is losing the debate in public opinion in the United States. And American public opinion is one of its greatest allies and has been for decades. Attacks on government or by government and by party leaders that use anti-American stereotypes, that accuse the United States of being a mastermind of events in the region, may be acceptable rhetoric for some people in the region, but when it reaches these shores, it actually affects people here as well. Some take this rhetoric with a grain of salt.
and some do not. As the U.S. perceives in the same process that the Kurds are somehow being more helpful in dealing with ISIS than Turkey is, this becomes, I think, a worrying trend for Turkey. So let me suggest 4 components that I think are part of a solution going forward. Analysts, of course, are always right because they're dissecting facts. Policymakers are always wrong because they have to put their money on the table and play the cards, and the cards don't always play out the way they place their bets. But here are 4 components. If Turkey wants a solution in Syria, it needs to work with the United States on the 2 main points I just mentioned. First, the priority of the threat. It may be that Assad is the longer-term threat, but the immediate threat is ISIS, and it must be dealt with before Assad is dealt with. Secondly, the lead must come from one of the nations or a collection of the nations in the region, and the U.S. must supplement that force. ISIS must be stopped first. The main effort must come from the region. Secondly, there will be a tendency, as the Kurds appear to be more successful in places like Kobane, protecting their region in northeast Iraq, to tilt towards the Kurds over Turkey. There will be a tendency, as emphasis is put on Iraq, to rebuild its army and to capture back some of the territory that was lost, to tilt towards Iraq over Turkey, especially if Turkey continues to be critical and passive in its reactions to the circumstances. These forces are filling a vacuum that Turkey could fill. And so the U.S. needs to remain constant in its commitment to back Turkey against the terrorist actions of the PKK, and also to support Turkey's peace process with the Kurds and to work with the Turks in order to find a better relationship between Ankara and Baghdad. Third, at the moment, Baghdad's army is the key to pushing ISIS back. Turkey has not given any indication that it will intervene. The Peshmerga are not capable of conquering the whole of Syria and the rest of Iraq, nor do the Iraqis in Baghdad wish them to do so. And the United States should not take the lead effort by putting its own army on the ground. The U.S. should, however, commit to strengthen reconnaissance, use of special forces, combat advisors in the front lines with the people who are fighting, whoever they are, and that would be a major step forward for the U.S. I don't consider it to be one of those inevitable steps that commits the U.S. to a wider war, but I do agree that airstrikes alone are not going to solve this problem. Finally, the Iraqi army has to have time to rebuild, and during that time, Turkey has an important role to play in reducing financial support, reducing recruiting support, affecting the aura of invincibility that is the hallmark of the ISIS ideology. And without that key component, the non-military component that Turkey can also be essential in providing, the military effort will take longer and be more complicated and have unforeseen results for all the countries in the region. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I also wanted to thank TPC for organizing this evening's gathering. Since its inception just a few years ago, I think TPC has done great events and put together great activities. So thank you again, Atta, for doing this. It's a hard act for me to follow Bob's shoes, but I'll fill in Bob's shoes. But what I'll do is I'll try to follow his act by providing some ideas to fill in this bigger picture that he has delivered for us, which is that obviously there's a lot of room for the two countries to cooperate. There are places where they have done well and there are places where they haven't done well. So let me start by kind of a more detailed analysis of Turkish policy and US policy in Syria. I think Turkey's policy in Syria, if you look at it in the last few years, is really a test case of the new Turkey, meaning a country that's economically confident because it's doing so well compared to its previous self, meaning Turkey always used to grow, but it would then have recession following periods of growth. So Turks never had this kind of period of 12 years of economic stability, which has been the case under the current government, which has, I think, installed in many Turks and the government a sense of can-do attitude, not just at home, but also in foreign policy. So not only does Turkey look good compared to its previous self economically, but it looks good compared to its neighbors. Turkey's neighbors are a dozen, and all of them have gone through political economic troubles in the last decade. The list includes, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Ukraine, Russia, Bulgaria. There's not one country in that list that did not suffer from economic downturn, political upheaval, war, occupation, or a multiplicity of these problems. Turkey has not had any of these problems, and I think that's not only driven a sense of confidence at home, but also can-do attitude in foreign policy. Enter the Syrian war. Until the war in Syria started, it looked as if Turkey's Middle East policy of trying to gain influence was working, and it was. The country had built good ties with pretty much all of its neighbors, although its ties with Israel had unraveled. But Turks could take stock in the fact that they could fly to Damascus and Tehran and Baghdad and Cairo, and they were received well everywhere, and economic ties were booming, and trade was increasing, and Turkey's cabinet even had joint sessions with the Syrian cabinet. This was a regular thing. The war in Syria started, and Turkey's impression was that it had built power in the region, meaning it could go to Damascus and advise them to reform and not to crack down on the demonstrators. That's exactly what the foreign minister, now Prime Minister Davutoğlu, did. He arrived in Damascus, advised the Syrian government to not use force. Only 6 hours after he left, the government of Syria sent tanks into the cities for the first time. Basically, this was a clear snub to Turkey that not only did Turkey have no influence in Syria, but also that Damascus really had other patrons, Tehran, that it would look to. And that should have been a wake-up call, perhaps, but people did not catch it in Ankara, that Turkey's economic influence was not matched by its political influence, because I think Turkey was missing and still is, and this is why I think U.S.-Turkish cooperation is still essential, was missing and still is missing from its arsenal elements of hard power. It's an economically powerful country, its citizens live better off, and they're wealthy, but Turkey does not have the proxies, intelligence assets, or the hardware to change the situation on the ground in Syria. Turkey's policy has been regime change, oust the Assad regime. That requires the country to have proxies in Syria. That requires Turkey to have the intelligence assets to work towards that goal, as well as to have the military hardware, and I think all of that is lacking. So for me, Syria is an interesting case which has shown that Turkey has tried to punch above its weight in Syria and the Middle East in general, and that has failed. So it requires a rethinking of this approach in Ankara. And for looking at it from the U.S. side, I think U.S. policy on Syria, but also broader Levant, has in the past number of years looked at these two countries increasingly, in the past decade at least increasingly, as if they were separate entities and that their problems could be isolated. I think what we saw with the emergence of ISIS is that because Iraq was a weak state to begin with, and because Syria became decentralized as a result of the war, you have two neighboring decentralized and weak states. So the border between them became increasingly not only penetrable but also meaningless, in the sense that it exists only on maps. That's why ISIS, which started in Iraq, but which was pushed by the Iraqi government into Syria, grew in Syria and came back into Iraq. And I think a strategy that targets ISIS just in Iraq is not going to succeed, because the organization will move back into Syria, where it will grow and come back into Iraq, and you'll have this vicious cycle. So any U.S. strategy to target ISIS, I think, has to treat Iraq and Syria as one theater, not two separate countries, but one theater, so that this includes not just anti-ISIS measures, but also other measures that has to go to the roots of the problem. Number one, Sunni exclusion in Iraq. Sunni tribal members are joining al-Qaeda and ISIS, not because they're pro-al-Qaeda, but because they feel excluded and persecuted by the current government in Iraq, which is Shiite-dominated. And they have not just been excluded, in my view, they've been persecuted. The government has used violence to cut down on these demonstrations. And as a result of that, I think you're seeing a mobilization among Sunni Arabs at large numbers that would not be possible otherwise. A second element of this broader theater that we have to look at is, as Bob mentioned, the Assad regime. I think the regime's war has led to a radicalization of the opposition in Syria. In 2011, I would ask my journalist friends who went to Syria and say, what percentage of the fighters are radicals? They would say, Soner, it's probably about 3 to 5%. 2012, I would say, what percentage? They would say 10. 2013, it was 50. Now it's predominant. This went from 4 years of a small presence to a majority presence among rebels, and I think we have missed a chance perhaps to support the moderate rebels, but that's gone. But we can't delve in that too much. I think what we have to do is to look at the future. So how do we get out of this? One area I would say is, once again, to look at where both countries can work together, though their priorities are different. Turkey's priority is still ousting the Assad regime, and U.S. priority is defeating, containing, and degrading ISIS. Turkey has, of course, ISIS as a concern, but it really is so much focused on ousting the Assad regime that I think it really needs Turkey to come around from this idea because except for Turks and Saudis, there's no country that's aggressively pushing for that goal right now, meaning the goal of ousting the Assad regime. So Turkey is very much isolated in its neighborhood when it comes to forcing the Assad regime out. And on top of this, I think even though Assad might be personally forced out, there's a fact that his regime has been able to use the sectarian and ethnically divided nature of Syria to form a popular basis for his regime. He is supported by the Christians and the Alawites and the Druze and the urban Sunnis. You add them up, that makes 40% of the population, even more. So Syria is more of a divided country in civil war than a country in which the people are in a war against a regime. I think the war has morphed, although this is how it started. So Turkey has to come to terms with recognizing this reality, that it will have to live with Assad or a country, part of which is going to be controlled Assad's supporters. And that, I think, requires a lot of soul searching. I think for the United States, of course, the tough issue is not just fighting ISIS, but also doing this, as Bob said, with Turkey, but also looking at the many complications of this puzzle, take into account the PKK issue, the recent attack on Kobane that came by ISIS. The reason why I think we all heard about Kobane and became a sudden news item is not because it's anything different than what ISIS done in previous places. It's because Kobane sits on the border with Turkey, meaning this is the first time CNN was able to broadcast live from a city under siege by ISIS. We have no idea what horrible things ISIS did in Raqqa and Mosul when it took over, because there was no CNN there. I think, and therefore would not react in the same way we reacted to Kobane. I think, therefore, because this border town is right across from Turkey and because you had international media presence, it really brought it up on the news, and obviously the reaction was to stop ISIS advance. It made the Turks unhappy that the United States airdropped weapons to PYD, which is the branch of PKK in Syria. As the peace talks in Turkey are on thin ice, the United States has to be extremely careful, I think, to not be seen as a country that is helping PKK in Syria, although it's called another organization, PYD, because that would be seen by many Turks as direct assistance to the PKK. Although one could argue that these two groups are different, I think there's a lot of overlap between them, and that requires a policy that's extremely careful in addressing this issue. Final point, I think, moving forward, if with the midterm elections, we're seeing a more assertive U.S. policy now in Syria, which might include more pushback against the Assad regime. One area, of course, would be where you could see some Turkish-U.S. cooperation is this idea of safe havens and no-fly zones. This has been floated since the beginning of the war, meaning you would have safe havens in the north and in the south where refugees could be hosted, and there'd be no-fly zones so that rebel-held territory could be protected against the advances of the Assad regime and his airplanes. The U.S. has so far stayed away from this because it means that, even though this is a Turkish idea to have safe havens, it's really U.S. military power that's going to impose it and protect it. So it requires U.S. commitment, which was not obviously available. But I think this is now an issue that's going to come up, especially because of the war around Aleppo. Syria is actually the largest city, more populous than the capital, Damascus. Of course, many of its inhabitants have left it. It's emptied out. FSA and other elements of the rebels hold on to parts of that city, and the regime is about to encircle them. So that could result in massive exodus of refugees, and Turkey's policy has always been to take refugees, and Turkey has graciously hosted up to 2 million refugees with very little international assistance, spending, I believe, as of last count, about $5 billion. But Turkey might act if it's facing a really massive flow of refugees. It might actually push the international community further towards the idea of putting these safe havens and no-fly zones into reality. And with the new alignment on the Capitol Hill, I can see how you could suddenly see support for that, especially if this is within the background of a humanitarian disaster, close to the Turkish border. Aleppo is only 20 miles, broadcast live. There is the area between Aleppo and Turkish border is controlled by the opposition, meaning media can penetrate in there. So you could really see this battle become a forefront issue and galvanize public opinion here and in Turkey, and that could bring unprecedented cooperation. But it really all depends on, obviously, the alignment on the ground. Why don't I stop here, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Sebnem?
Thank you. I would like to start also by thanking TPC for organizing this event and Goethe Institute for hosting it. I'm going to actually talk about economics, so it's going to be very different from the last two talks, partly because, I don't know that much about foreign policy or the military dimension of the issue, but I'm a professor of economics and finance, so I know a lot about economics side of the issue. So let me make 3 points. The first one is on the economic cost of the situation. Obviously, the humanitarian cost is, undescribable. So I'm not even going to try to pretend one of those, cold-hearted economists and then try to put the human cost side to the background. It's just that, since all of us will be speaking on that dimension, I thought I'm going to focus on the economic cost because that's going to be very relevant in terms of the current economic situation of Turkey and, going forward about, how to do or if Turkey can afford a military intervention and then put an army on the ground. So the direct cost of this is so far estimated around 2 billion. And that's related to approximately 1 million refugees, Syrian refugees being in Turkey. To put things in perspective, Germany so far accepted only 5,000, and that 5,000 has to be skilled refugees. So this goes back to the point made by Ambassador that Turkey really, really deserves a big praise here, where European Union is not accepting anybody pretty much, while Turkey is trying to absorb over 1 million. Now, 2 billion, is that a lot? Turkey's GDP is 800 billion, so that's around, less than 1%. But on the other hand, this is also the monthly amount of the current account deficit, which is the key economic vulnerability of the Turkish economy. In addition, we shouldn't just think of course, the direct monetary cost of this, especially given the humanitarian side of the issue, but we should really focus on the indirect costs. Now, the indirect costs are very important because the first indirect cost is going to be on the unemployment issue. Right now, Turkey is at 10% unemployment, which is not maybe as high as some of the southern European countries, but still high. And the problem with the refugee situation is that, as in any refugee situation, refugees are willing to work for lower wages, and that's going to disrupt the obvious equilibrium in the labor market. I mean, you might say, well, isn't this a good thing? We see study after study about Mexican immigrants in Texas and how this is a good thing for the natives in Texas. That's correct only if you have a flexible labor market, which is the case in the United States. This wouldn't be correct in Turkish case and wouldn't be also correct in European case. This is why now we are talking about unemployment numbers going up to 50% in Spain. So this is going to be a serious, very serious indirect cost in Turkish case. Now combine that with other economic vulnerabilities of Turkey. Turkey's growth now slowed down to 3%. Inflation is at 9%, almost reaching 10% double-digit level. And it would have been actually if the tide on the commodity prices didn't reverse. So right now we are the other side of the tide where the oil prices is decreasing, which is going to hurt countries like Argentina. It's going to benefit countries like Turkey. But still, they were very, very close to passing that double-digit mark on inflation. And this is very important because Turkey is also a country with a current account deficit of 8% of GDP. What does it mean? Turkey needs to externally finance its deficit. That means they need to borrow 40% of their GDP. So that's huge, right? That's a key vulnerability in Turkish case. Now, let me try to put this in perspective a little bit with what has been said. You know, Turkey thought they have political influence in the region because they had economic influence. Let me try to clarify a little bit that economic influence. It is true that Turkey did tremendously well in the last 12 years. Tremendous growth, tremendous stability. You know, we are talking about a GDP per capita of $15,000 right now, and it used to be $5,000, so tripling. But let me explain how this happened. Turkey went through a major financial crisis in 2001. A very similar one happened in the United States in 2007, 2008, and then in Europe, 2009, 2010. And when Turkey went through that major financial crisis, you know, it hit bottom. And then it started recovering. So we call this V-shaped recovery. Every single emerging market economy that goes through that serious financial crisis goes through a V-shaped recovery. You can see same in Argentina, Mexico, Brazil, East Asian countries in the 90s, Russia. So this is a typical recovery. So in that sense, at the beginning, in terms of economics, none of us were surprised. Plus, there was an IMF program. IMF came to help. They didn't come to help in Argentina, but they did come to help in Turkey. And there was a program that they had to stick to, meaning they have to save fiscally, what is European countries trying to do now. They have to cut on the inflation. They have to adopt inflation targeting, which helped them tremendously. That's when the first time in Turkish history they started seeing single-digit inflation. And then they had to, of course, narrow down current account deficit. So it's not about like, this government did that. They had to do that. There was a structural program in place, and they got money for it, and they paid for that money, a couple years ago. So the thing they did right is what Argentina didn't do. They didn't mess up with the program, and they stick to it, and they left, people who knows how to run these things, successful bureaucrats and economists in central bank at peace. So they the government let them do their job, right? That's the first part of the tide. So we are talking about now a period from 2003 to 2006-07. And then, this is, I think, really kind of a double whammy, very good luck that for Turkish case, the crisis happened in the United States and Europe. So now you're in a situation that all the developed countries in the world are in crisis. Of course, all the foreign capital starting to flow into emerging markets. Turkey, again, is not alone in this. Mexico, Brazil, South Africa, and all these countries benefited from that. But in Turkish case, now they got these two amazing rides. They rode these two amazing tides. One is the typical recovery from a very deep financial crisis. And then second, immediately after that, the fact that developed world is in crisis and a lot of people, a lot of investors, foreign investors want to invest in emerging markets. So of course this brought a lot of growth, a lot of stability, good things. But if you look at the situation right now, we are talking about a country with 9% inflation, 10% unemployment, 8% current account deficit, where 40% of GDP has to come from outside. So this is not a country that any economic textbook would put on the table as a strong economy situation, okay? If you look at these statistics, these type of statistics show you that a crisis is looming and coming. One of the books I can cite on that is This Time is Different by Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reiner. And then they look at 100 years of histories, right? And each time, these four things, current account deficit, inflation, unemployment, and external financing needs, when they come together, you end up with a crisis. And as we learned in the last 5 years, this is not unique to emerging markets. This is exactly also, what happened to many developed countries. So in that sense, I wouldn't put Turkish economic situation right now in a, rosy place. Okay, this is my first point. Let me go to the second point. The Syria situation, the Middle East situation, and the economic situation is creating a lot of uncertainty. And we know that uncertainty is really bad for growth. Now, if you're an emerging market like Turkey or China, you don't want to grow 1% or 2%. That's the growth rate that US can afford or European countries can afford. You want to grow at 6, 7, 8%. That's a typical growth rate for an emerging market country, if they want to catch up, okay? And this is what was happening to countries like Turkey and China in the last 10, 15 years. Now, for that, you need a lot of stability and really pretty much no uncertainty. If you have uncertainty, then you are going to cut into this growth because investment is going to go down. People don't want to invest in any physical investment or human capital, their own human capital. Education is going to go down, and that's going to bring down long-term growth, right? We are not talking about now yearly growth rates. We are talking about medium to long-term growth, which is what countries like Turkey has to achieve. Now, this is, in that sense, very important that once you're in a situation like that, you have a tremendous uncertainty in terms of the situation in the Middle East, and economically, you have an amazing amount of brain drain. This has always been a problem in Turkey and any other emerging market country, right? I mean, there is a brain drain, meaning most of the people who come to the United States to get an education end up staying in the United States or in Europe. Turkey actually managed to start reversing this before all these events started. And actually the last 3-4 years, a lot of the US PhDs, Turkish students who came to US to get their PhDs, you know, the number is around like 30%, 40%, somewhere between, they went back. This is actually, you know, a very good thing, because normally a very limited amount go back. But on the other hand, what is being missed is the skilled workforce at a higher level, more senior level. So now not the students who get their PhD and go back, but university professors who are already established and skilled, or, you know, high-level managers, high-level corporates, they're actually leaving the country. This trend started in the last 2 years, and this is very, very worrying, because you need that level personnel in universities, in businesses, to train the newcomers, right? And this is at the key junction of the Turkish economic policy and how they want Turkish economic policy, because they want to increase education, to increase research and development, and to increase growth. So now we are in a situation where a lot of actually people are leaving the country. The people, of course, who can, right, who can afford to live, who can, not everybody can just get a job when they are 40 years old in, you know, United States or Japan or Canada and Europe. So this is still a limited group, but it is very worrying that we have such a group. I mean, Boğaziçi University, the top, you know, school in Istanbul, they lost 10% of their faculty. This is a very worrying trend, to the fact that, you know, such a skill level people at such a late age in their life leaving the country with their families and children and everything. So this is, I think, very important in terms of uncertainty, in terms of morale, in terms of going forward. And this is going to hamper growth, medium term and long term, tremendously. My third point. So what does it all mean in terms of going forward? As I said at the beginning of my talk, I don't know that much about the foreign policy issues, but I know this. Since the establishment of the Republic, 1923, 1930s, Turkey had a specific policy. This is our border, and we don't get into the Middle East business, right? And obviously, there were up and downs all, you know, along the road. I mean, there were never maybe a big threat in ISIS, but there were other threats. And clearly there were mistakes done. But they stick to that policy, and that policy served them very, very well. Because there's 1,000 years of history here. This is not an easy thing to do. This is not easy to keep peace in the Middle East. This goes back to, you know, 1300s. And that policy put initially by Atatürk worked very well, right? So we have to protect our border and our own country, and we are responsible to our own citizens and our own domestic economy. This is unfortunately now completely gone. And this is part of the AKP government's policy. And then unfortunately, the legacy of the AKP government could have been growth and stability and all that. But now it is actually putting Turkey in this unfortunate mess and, you know, pretty much, you know, creating all these terrorists coming through the border inside the country. This is clearly a situation that is very, very hard to resolve. I fully agree that it requires cooperation of both the United States and Turkey and the Europeans. But on the other hand, we have to stop and ask ourselves, why? I mean, just because this government wants some sort of influence in the Middle East, I mean, they decided to adopt a policy without even thinking twice about it. So just because they want to get rid of Assad, I mean, this to me, it almost makes no sense. I mean, this is like, you know, a third grader deciding on something without thinking at all. So in that sense, I think this is going to be really, again, I mean, the history is going to be the judge. But right now, you know, I agree that the threat is serious, and now they are in that mess. You are not in a position anymore that I have to protect the border and I have to think about my own country. But on the other hand, they cannot afford to go and put an army on the ground. With this economy, with this morale, and with this much uncertainty, I don't see Turkey getting into a war in that part of the world at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Is that working? Is that working? Yes? Thank you. Thank you to the Turkish Policy Center. I just want to make a disclaimer that I do work for the United States government, but my views represent myself and not the Department of Defense. I was asked to look at what are some of the implications on the tensions between the Kurds today, the Syrian civil war, and for the prospects of the peace process in Turkey. We've seen just recently renewed violence in southeast Turkey with the Kurds. You've heard discourses about, it's over. The PKK leaders or Kurdish leaders from Turkey are threatening again to end the process. While it seems that way, I'd like to look at what really is at stake. What are some of the Kurdish claims? How much leverage do they really have? And what are some of the dynamics that happened just over the last year with this ISIS campaign, the anti-ISIS campaign, the Syrian civil war, and what does this mean for the prospects? Can Turkey really move forward? Is this really stalled? And what are some of the options? Before I start, let's look at what is the root here, and what are some of the Kurdish claims in Turkey. And I think one of the misperceptions or perceptions, the Kurdish nationalist claims are deeply rooted in their ethnic identity. This is not about the Kurds want to be called fellow Sunni Muslims. Now, is a strong group or an important group of Kurds in southeast Turkey who are some of President Erdogan's biggest supporters, and we've seen that as the AK Party election results. But this is not what the Kurdish nationalists who are negotiating with the Turkish government are about. These are the BDP, the PKK, the secular ethnic Kurdish nationalists. So that's one part of it. Secondly, this is beyond cultural rights. This has moved from, the issue of the snake bites the snake charmer, where it was once cultural rights and it was good enough to have language. Now it's about political issues. And you've heard this move from we want a language, we want school, we want democratic autonomy, and gradually the goalposts are changing over time. We've seen the same thing happen in Iraq. So right now, the essential part of this is, for the Kurds in Turkey, this is a political issue. They're not quite clear, but nonetheless, it is something that has turned back and strengthening. There's also a demonstration effect that the Kurds are building off of other democratization movements, whether they succeeded or not, but nonetheless, they're influenced by other nationalist movements, and forces the spillover effect from the Kurdistan region of Iraq. There's not a Kurd in Turkey that I know that looks at the Kurdistan region and says, my goodness, I want to be like that feudal region over there. I too want to be like the Emirate of Barzani. But what they do want is greater autonomy. And they are looking to this idea of these Kurds in Turkey, these Kurds in Iraq having some form of autonomy and some form of replication in Turkey. And the same goes to the Kurds in Syria, and you'll probably find this sooner or later in Iran. There's another key point here that we should think about when Turkey's negotiating, is that these Kurds in Turkey are very closely linked to Syrian Kurds. It's different with the Iraqi Kurds, and this goes back historically, socioeconomically. These are deep family ties. Kurds in Syria once lived in Turkey. Kurds in Turkey, they were displaced. You had Hatay province. And so when you would normally look at this dialectic that would be, what is the relationship between the Kurds and the Turkish state, you have in the Turkish situation what's going on in Syria as well. Not directly, but it is certainly influencing this. And finally, you have these two main Kurdish nationalist tendencies that have nothing to do with Turkey, but this is the Öcalan PKK tendency, which is more left-leaning and secular, and then the Barzani tendency. And these are two strong nationalist currents right now. And they're competing with each other. Sometimes it's discreetly, sometimes it's outright Cold War. As of 6 months ago, there was actually a trench built between Iraq and Syria, keeping these two apart. So these five main, I'd say, features of the Kurds, whether transborder or within the region, are shaping this movement. Now, what has happened? We can easily say, goodness, Turkey didn't go save the Kurds in Kobane. They really, made a mistake. It's far deeper than that. Part of it, yes, has been the failure to really move forward with political reforms. As I said, this is not about cooking classes or Kurdish language classes. To what extent are real political issues been addressed as opposed to time-gaining tactics to gain elections? By that I mean constitutional changes, changing the threshold, whatever it may be. But the Syrian civil war has also been an issue in which the Kurds in Turkey and Syria, because I said they're very close here, have been able to take advantage of. So they're both on the opposite sides of the war. And whether Turkey's supporting Assad, certainly the PYD and the PKK are not. Why? because Erdogan wants some strong Sunni Arab nationalist group in Syria, and that's the last thing that the PKK and the PYD would like to see. Certainly one that's strong Arab nationalist and Islamist in nature. So you already had these tendencies working themselves out in Syria. Now, how have the Kurds benefited? And I fully agree with Ambassador Pearson that this whole anti-ISIS campaign and these local partnerships that the US-led coalition is building is certainly benefiting the Kurds. Not only in Iraq, but you have this whole big issue of gaining international recognition and gaining international credibility. And certainly the United States and coalition partners have made it clear that the PKK remains a terrorist group, but the PYD is a distinct group. So therefore they get airdropped munitions, and even if it is just a one-time only movement, they have certainly been able to use this to semi-legitimize the PKK and its supporters internationally. And this is just, I was in the north of Iraq working in 1992 for those years, and this international recognition indiscreetly helps build up some of these local groups. So this is nothing new, but what it has done, it has allowed the PYD and the PKK to take advantage of these political opportunities to create new facts on the ground. We saw the same patterns in North Iraq after 2003, and it is continuing. Another point is the PKK has benefited, it has become a hero. This is even beyond gaining for Kobane. That when the Islamic State, I don't know if you remember, when they came into Mosul in June, and just weeks later, first the Iraqi Kurds were waving their new maps because they had 45,000 square kilometers now, and they had a 1,000-kilometer border with ISIS, which I would certainly not be jumping around about, that the withdrawal of the Barzani Peshmerga forces, and which left the Yazidi stranded, it was the PKK that went and saved them. And this today, they're riding on this. I mean, President Barzani has lost a lot of face inside the region for this, but who has gained, is my point, and it has certainly been the PKK. There have been tens and thousands of demonstrations throughout Iraq, the Kurdistan region, Syria, Turkey, or not so much in Turkey, in support of the PKK, in support of Kobane. You've seen this. It's about saving Kobane. You could see the placards among the Kurdish people about this issue. So now you have a new territorial red line. Now you have a new myth. This symbolically that Kobane now is emerging as this integral part of Kurdistan region, as Kirkuk is. So the peace process is now being linked to Kobane. And I go back to what I said about changing the goalposts. That for some Kurds along the way, they're now saying, look, Turkey, not only did you not now get Öcalan out of prison, because that's now a part of the deal, but you now didn't save Kobane. And I think this is overreach, but I'm looking at how some of the Kurdish groups, whether that be in Turkey or their affiliates in Syria, are taking advantage or hoping to reap benefits from some of the international empathy and support for the Kurds. There's another point here, though, and I predict it, and I shouldn't make predictions, but there's going to be Kurdish overstep. And that is to say, when you create new facts on the ground, when you start shifting your red lines, and banking on international support without making the necessary alliances on the ground, i.e. Sunni Arabs, this could come back to haunt them as well. Some kind of deals are going to have to be made. But in the meantime, as the Kurds get this idea that they actually now are being legitimized internationally, and I go back to the Kurds in Iraq, they may not feel that they have to cut a deal because they can go to their international lobbyists, or they can go. So, we have to think clearly about how much international support can actually lead to secondary consequences that could undermine our long-term goals, which is if you want a peace process, you have to make it in the interest of the parties to have no alternatives but to do so. There is also some other issues, and maybe we can discuss, and this comes within Turkey itself. We had these debates last year about, is there really a paradigm shift in Turkish thinking as well? I mean, a lot of this depends on Turkish popular opinion. In the United States, we like to believe that the PKK problem went away because Erdogan was able to go to Diyarbakir with Barzani and host some singing, and Barzani went there. And is there really, there was a wonderful poll that was given to me by my Turkish student, Metropole, and there was, asking the tolerance of the ISIS and PKK. And according to the poll, In Turkey, the overwhelming majority of Turkish people said, do you see ISIS and PKK as a threat? And there was a very small margin. 85.9% said the PKK, and 86.2% for ISIS. And the same thing is, which is a bigger threat, the PKK or ISIS? And it was 41% and 43%, which is not surprising to me. I mean, some people were saying, wow, I can't believe there wasn't a bigger margin. And for me, why would you think there wasn't a bigger margin? Preserving the territorial integrity of Turkey is sacrosanct. So, again, to what extent has some of these perceptions of the PKK changed in Turkey, and how far can actually Turkish leaders go? So, how can we help the peace process move forward or not move forward? I'll say what's not going to work. One, addressing Kurds as fellow Sunni Muslims. This discourse that President Erdogan, and he has made significant efforts, and I credit him for this, but there has been a misperception and misconception, in my view, to think that you can appease or co-opt Kurds as Sunni Muslims. They are, but 80 years of state-building policies in Iraq and Turkey and Syria and Iran, when you had secular nationalist states emerge, Turkish nationalism has evolved in relation to these ethnic and secular nationalisms. If you don't address the Kurdish issue as an ethnic secular issue, you're going to be skirting around it. Jobs and economic development, look, that's worked to a point. It's worked in northern Iraq. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition. The PKK and the Kurds did not fight 30 years of war to have a job. So there's going to be, and again, it's been exacerbated by the fact that you've got this trans-border Kurdish movement that is so embedded with its significant international lobby right now supporting the Kurds. Another big mistake, to a point, is thinking that Barzani will be the negotiator and the envoy for Turkey to negotiate the Kurdish problem. This is a mistake. And I go back to the two main tendencies. There's only so much that Barzani can do, and if you even look inside the Kurdistan region of Iraq, parsing it out, the influence of the Barzani group really is a small governor of Duhok and half of Erbil. If you look at Kirkuk, Suleimania, and part of Erbil, you've got other groups that are actually somewhat having alliances with the PKK. So be careful about thinking that Masoud Barzani, and I'm not trying to discredit him here, it's not his, but he cannot have influence and shape, and this is why, for the last 2 years, trying to get the Syrian Kurds to join the Syrian National Coalition through Barzani is not going to work, and it's still not going to work. So there is limited influence. There is influence among Barzani tribes in Syria, in the Jazeera. There's influence about Barzani tribes in Hakkari area, but it's really not going to go much further, even if you create a Kurdish nationalist party in Turkey that's affiliated with Barzani. That's not going to do it. This is why, by the way, when they had that wonderful meeting in Diyarbakir and people were so ecstatic that, Shavan Perwer and everybody was singing, there was a lot of Kurds that were really angry about this, and they didn't really take it seriously. It was symbolic, but it can only go so far. That's the same thing like the nationalist discourse. So understand these limitations. Understand even deepening ties with Iraqi Kurds are not going to resolve this problem. What could you do? What would I do? One of the main complaints of these Kurds in Turkey is, have these open discussions. It's not just these quiet backdoor meetings with Öcalan, but Demirtas and some of the BDP leaders bringing this out in an open, institutionalizing the discussions, because this has been a complaint. I'm not saying this is all going to go away, because I'm usually a cynic and not optimistic. So, but nonetheless, bringing in parliamentary representatives, bringing in the leaders that some of the Kurdish activists on the ground are, Öcalan's been in prison for a long time, and symbolically he's the leader. Nonetheless, leverage Kurdish interests as well. Just remember, I know the Kurds have some interest and capabilities to threaten Turkey, but they're not in a position to fight two fronts. They're fighting ISIS, and we all know that the PYG is PKK, and they can't take on the Turkish military and ISIS at the same time. And just remember, as the Kurds are trying so hard in Turkey and Syria to gain international recognition, the way that the Iraqi Kurds did. If you want to gain international recognition, you better not dare start engaging in a terrorist movement again inside Turkey, because those will fall right down. So, there is still some leverage that the international community can play in terms of, getting that back on track. And political reforms. You have to be careful, because the Kurds say, well, we want now Öcalan out of prison and we want you to save Kobane, keep it clear, but if it's a political issue. So start with the Constitution, lower the election threshold, these small political measures can actually show some better faith, in my view, than opening up a school or the languages, and that's part of it too. But I would start with some of these political measures on the ground. And you've got this Syria issue, again, that's going to have to play itself out. But if you make it in the incentive of these Kurds at least to focus on what's happening in Turkey, we can at least minimize the potential for conflict. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. Cenk? Please.
Thank you, first of all, for organizing this. I think we covered all the major components of the Syrian conflict in this panel. We talk about the foreign policy, economy, the Kurdish aspect, the domestic politics a little bit. But I will try to talk about the macro level implications of the Syrian policy on this major three pillars of the Turkish political system, which are the economy, foreign politics, and foreign policy and the domestic politics. And not surprisingly, they're all connected with each other and they're intertwined. And the Syria policy was at the epicenter of all these problems and the risks created from the mishandling of the Syrian conflict in today's political environment. And today, in my piece on the Radical newspaper, I basically argued that the Turkey is at its highest risk level environment from all these three different pillars today, not because of only the domestic reasons or not because of the government's mistake, but also the global systems or the global uncertainties surrounding Turkey today from the economic perspective and from the political and foreign policy perspective. So Syrian issue may be a great case study for any political science class to show how to turn a foreign policy issue into a domestic and economic conflict and economic crisis within a country. So it was very interesting because I don't argue that the Syrian crisis created all these problems. Those problems were existing in Turkey's political system. Some did come before the AKP period, some did come with the AKP. But when we look at the foreign policy, we see after 2009 and 2010, there was some confusion that the Turkish foreign policy makers have been dealing with, especially within the Arab Spring. There was some very inconsistent statement on the Libya conflict and then Egypt, and the Syria became kind of the last point that the inconsistent and kind of dangerous policy decisions created the risk environment for Turkey. The economy is the same. I think that from 2002, I don't want to repeat what Sebnem said. I agree with all her analysis of the current economic environment. But I think after 2007, the economic growth has been fueled by the increase in the credits and some growth based not only on manufacturing and the export, but more on the consumption in the country. So after 2007, the self-confidence they created for the period between 2002 and 2007 created understanding within the Turkish economic leadership that they don't need the IMF anymore and they can build their own program. And after that, there was a downward slide because 2002, 2007 growth rate is around 7.3%, but after 2007 and 2012 is like 3.5%. And after 2004, probably we will be facing a lower growth rate, around 3% within the best scenario. And Turkey needs 6% growth to continue its sustainability. I mean, I will say 6% very sharp, but it's, I was working on a project on that. We made some calculations. In order to make the unemployment rate as a steady level around 5%, which is an exact number, you need 6% growth. If you cannot meet 6% growth rate, then you have significant troubles within your macro imbalances. And I'm not going to talk about the inflation going up, 9.6%, current account deficit, and other risk levels. So I'm not saying these problems created by the Syrian conflict, those were coming before the Syrian issue, but the Syrian conflict made it more obvious because now we have the refugee issue that we are dealing with, again, 1.6 million refugees. And just think about, I think a very interesting comparison is thinking about in 60, 700,000 Turkish people immigrated to Germany. And their jobs were readily waiting for them. The German government was ready to accept them and integrate the society. They knew where to go when they get out of the train station. They had almost the houses or the social securities and the insurances ready. Now we have almost 2.5 times more than this number living in Turkey. They don't have jobs, they don't have skills, they don't have a long-term planning that was made for them by the government. So it's great, Turkey is taking care of these people. I think it's a very humanitarian approach. I totally agree with it, and I think it's the right thing to do. But if you accept 1.6 million people to a country, you need to build a long-term strategy, how to integrate them to the society and how to integrate them to the labor market. And I think another interconnected nature of the crisis, the Syrian issue, and I think Sebnem summarized what will be the implications for the economy. But let's talk about the domestic polarization, domestic tension point of view. These people live in 75% of 1.6 million people live outside of the camps. So people think these people live in the camps. Only 25% of these people live in the camps. They have their housing, they have their food, they have their basic needs covered. 75% live on the streets. Some of them brought their financial resources from Syria. They set up their shops, they set up their grocery store, their supermarket, their Syrian restaurant. But majority of them didn't come with anything. So they're begging on the streets. They're competing for very low-paying jobs in Gaziantep, Kilis, Hatay. And once the unemployment goes above 9%, 10%, and the economy has been slowing, the domestic public will see these people as a threat to their existence. And we start seeing the Turkish people in the neighborhoods chasing Syrians. They're burning their stores, and it happened. I mean, it happened, I think it's not happening on a regular basis, but it happened in a few neighborhoods in Istanbul. It happened a few times in Antep, and it's gonna go worse. And what's gonna happen there? There's a great example how to turn foreign policy mishandling into a domestic and economic crisis. So let's talk about more from the foreign policy and the economy relationship. Again, one important thing is the investor confidence that also we talked earlier a little bit, but let's look at the numbers. Turkey needs to compete with other emerging markets in an environment that the global liquidity has been diminishing. And Turkey must also compete with other developed markets to increase exports. And in order to compete in global markets with other emerging markets, you need to have high-value manufacturing and high-value branding, high-tech products to compete, because you're losing the competitiveness in the lower technology products like the textile, the food or other markets to other countries. Like now Cambodia won a lot of market share from Turkey, the Vietnam did. So you need to produce high-level products. And in order to produce high-level products, you need to basically spend money on the research and development, or you need to build a very creative environment. You need to attract the creative labor force from the neighborhood, not only from the Middle East, but also from the other regions to help you to build new technologies together. It's not happening, and there's a brain drain happening right now. So you're losing that edge, and it's very concrete. When you look at the Doing Business Index of the World Bank, Turkey was on the 51st ranking, and now we got back to 55th. It has been announced last week. So we got back. We fell 4 ranks down only in a year after all this happened. And let's look at the World Economic Forum's global competitiveness report. Again, Turkey is on a decline on this report since 2012. So all the major indices that showing the investor confidence or the competitiveness have been on the decline because of the mistakes and the problems in the Turkish domestic politics as well. So let's talk about the Turkish domestic politics. I don't think we talk about it yet. I think it's very important. Turkish government made those mistakes in foreign policy and the economy, and we could, I think, most of the the big majority of the international analysts agree with those mistakes that we made on Syria and other issues. But the domestic politics has been even worse and worse. And Erdogan made the worst mistake an authoritarian leader could make. When authoritarian leaders make mistakes, they became more authoritarian. And then is a kind of like a cycle that is going worse and worse. Now you make more mistakes and then you becoming more authoritarian. So that's what happening to Turkey. Erdogan was a pragmatic leader. I think if you're talking about 2002, 2003, 2007, he was famous for being very pragmatic and turning from his mistakes, saying one thing and doing another. But now we see that he's insisting on the mistakes he makes, because I think he feels more challenged because of his position, and also because of the corruption investigation, as everything is going. He thinks everything is very existential at this point. And we're seeing the democracy has been tarnished in the country, the rule of law. I think that's the most important thing for the economic growth. Once you don't have very strong institutions that the investors and the businessmen can trust, you cannot expect them to do business in the country. So we lost a lot of trust in the institutions. Central bank policies have been under direct impact of Prime Minister and now President Erdogan. We see some politically motivated economic operations to some banks and some holdings. Earlier, Doğan Holding was under attack, and recently Bank Asya, the organization close to Gülen movement, is under attack because of political reasons. And once you build an example of such an incident in a competitive or so-called competitive market, you cannot expect the global players to come and really build R&D facilities in your country. That's very dangerous. And we're seeing more authoritarianism, less rule of law. The media has been under pressure. So all these things, have been fueled by the problems also in Syrian conflict, because the Kobane issue was was a part of the Syrian crisis, happened a few months ago, created a lot of question marks about the intentions of the AKP government on the Kurdish issue. From the beginning, I was very skeptical. I didn't think that you could resolve the Kurdish issue just negotiating with İmralı. I think Turkey needed to build a very comprehensive macro-democratic environment. You cannot talk to İmralı and make a deal with Kurdish groups, and on the other hand, you can use tear gas on your own people, Turkish citizens protesting the government in Taksim Square. So I think Kurds also had a misperception about, or I don't know, I would like to think that it was just a misperception, because when I was talking with the Kurdish leaders about these issues, I was saying, how can you expect a resolution? It was before Kobane, it was kind of after the Gezi protests. How can you expect this government to take the necessary reforms and make the steps towards the resolution of the Kurdish problem, whereas it's treating all its citizens in a very unfair and in a very basis? And so I think now, I think Kurds saw that. I mean, after the Kobane incident, we need to have a more macro level democracy in the country, not like a case study. We cannot isolate Kurds and provide them cultural and political rights. We need to build strong institutions, the rule of law, freedom of speech. It's a package deal. You can't just have one of them from this package deal. So to sum up, I would like to say, I think all these factors, I think Turkey is a very risky environment. It needs to resolve its problems in all these three pillars immediately. They're very existential. The economy is a very downward trend. I agree that all these imbalances may create a very significant crisis in Turkey. If not in 3 years, 5 years, for sure 10 years. Because what Turkish government has been doing is accumulating the risk, because you have your own central bank, you can play with some tools, and you can make it sustainable for maybe 1, 2, 3 more years, but you can't make it sustainable for 10 years. So this is a very major risk in front of Turkey. The foreign policy, Turkey is now seen as a Sunni actor in the Middle East, whereas the Sunni-Shia conflict has been becoming the major issue. Turkish was always a secular and democratic actor in the Middle East, even though it was not very active, and I would say the alternative is not just closing your doors and not handle the issue, but the alternative is to provide a very intellectual basis, a secular and democratic model in the Middle East. So now we see more Alawite-Sunni conflict in the country, more secular conservative conflict, more Kurdish-Turkish conflict. Polarization is very dangerous levels. So if you put all of them together, we can see there's a need for new understanding, a new political system in Turkey that would resolve these issues. And it's not very easy. It's not very easy like as talking, but I think that's the only exit from this dilemma that we are in today. Thank you.
Thank you, Cenk. Thank you to all our panelists. Now we have about 15 minutes left for Q&A. I promised that we'd end at 7 p.m. So we're going to, please no statements, just questions, and Lee will be passing around the mic. If I could just pass that along. There we go. And we'll get 2 questions at a time. So let's start with your setup. I think it's on. Is it?
The question is for Ambassador Pearson. You said that the public opinion in the U.S. about Turkey is important. Well, I agree with that. So is the public opinion of Turkey in the U.S. A lot of Turkish people consider, like Dr. Denise said, a lot of Turkish people consider ISIS and the PKK or PYD as equal level enemies, including me. And while AKP's priority is to get rid of the Assad regime, and yes, it's a dictatorship, so I can at some level understand that. Who's going to replace that? So that's not, in my opinion, an option. On the other hand, you said Turkey has to work with the U.S. Why? How would you convince the Turkish public opinion to work with the U.S. when Turkish people say, hey, yes, like Dr. Cagaptay said, Kobane was important because it was right at the border, you could report on it, but you also knew about Kobane, you knew about the initial ISIS attacks and overtakes, and nothing was done. There was no help to the Turkmens. So the opinion is, hey, those are allies, Kurds are allies of the US, and therefore they want to help their allies. If we help the Kurds, the Peshmergas, they're going to be our next enemy, and they're right at our border. How are you going to convince the public opinion of the Turks, that is also very important, to be part in this?
Thank you, Sevtap. Let's get, as I said, 2 questions at a time. So who is, well, okay, while you guys are thinking of an answer, I'll let Ambassador Pearson answer.
Sure. Okay. Well, one of the things I have to say that I have always admired about the Turks is that they have no hesitation in asking you direct questions. I think it's a choice. I think it's a choice. And I don't think it's really up to the Americans to convince the Turkish people. I think it's up to the Turkish government to lay out the case. I have a map here. I'm sorry that you're not going to be able to see it, of course, but it influenced me a lot. Everything from here to here is Kurdish, and everything from here to the coast is ISIS, or it is the collapsing Syrian opposition, okay? So that entire line of border is controlled by one of those groups. So in my opinion, as I pointed out, if ISIS were to win, and it were to even win against Damascus, you would have a radical Sunni extremist group controlling the entire country. In my opinion, the PKK is not likely to control the entire space of Syria. And therefore, for me, ISIS is the greater threat to the region. But you also heard me say that the U.S. has to be firm in its support of Turkey in dealing with the PKK, has to be firm in its support of Turkey in having the right balance with the Shia government in Baghdad. So my preference is that these two countries work together. But quite honestly, I don't think it's up to the U.S. to convince the Turkish people what to do. That's the Turkish government's responsibility. What I was saying is that I worry that the American people are getting the wrong impression about Turkey because of the flow of events. And when my countrymen are accused of being masterminds of some conspiratorial game in the region, that make nice press at home. But when people in the Congress hear that, they actually do wonder what is going on. So that's my point. But thank you very much for asking the question.
Thank you. We'll make sure to post that on our website after the discussion. Next question, please. Yes.
First, thank you very much. It was very interesting to listen to you. Dr. Natali, you mentioned that there are some secondary consequences that could come about with legitimization of the PKK in this region. I was wondering, do you see it as a possibility if they are armed, more soldiers are armed, the Peshmerga, the PKK in this region, do you see, or in Syria, do you see one of the consequences being similar to that in Libya, what happened in Mali? Do you want to take another one?
Yes, let's, thank you so much for the question. Let's try to get one more question. Yes.
Hi, Bev Godwin. Thank you very much to the panel for a very interesting debate. I'm particularly interested in the Syrian refugee question, and I was in Gaziantep just 3 weeks ago and saw firsthand people there tell me that of the 2 million Syrian refugees, 1 million of them are in Gaziantep. And for a city that is only 2 million in population, the infrastructure cannot handle it. And seeing all the homeless people on the streets, the beggars, and people telling me there's lots of violence and murders at night that are not reported in the press. So a lot of the predictions are already there. And Cenk Bey, if you could address what domestically, what solutions there might be, and Ambassador Pearson, internationally, what the U.S. and other countries might do to help the Syrian refugees.
Thank you for these questions. Would you like to start?
Yeah, do you want to answer to here? Thank you. I don't necessarily think, first of all, the arms are insignificant going to the PYD. These are small weapons, and in fact, the PYD or PYG is shown to be more capable than some of the Peshmerga in Iraq, who have the larger weapons, or have more weapons, not heavy weapons. For me, it's more political and symbolic. That is to say, the expectations, when you semi-legitimize a group through recognition, right? This is now raising the expectations, not only as their role in Turkey or their role in Syria, but you have to look, although we kind of look at what's going to happen tomorrow, and that's how we're planning. What happens in 3 years when all of this is going on and you're semi-legitimizing, you're creating the air cover for certain groups to take more territory and resources. So much of this creating new facts on the ground is what I'm talking about. It means if you look at a map of Syria, there aren't geographically contiguous Kurdish regions. There's an Arab belt strip in the middle. But some of this, what I see is this is going to be places where people can take territories and resources and source, when I say secondary consequence, source the next conflict. And the next conflict for me is going to be between Kurds and Arabs over territories and over oil. And the other one's going to be, how are you going to situate this? I'm not saying we need coalition partners on the ground. The United States is not putting boots on the ground, and this is why some of these local partners like the Kurds are so valuable. But if you don't have a consequent policy, what are you going to do with the PYD? Does this mean are you going to integrate them into a Syrian opposition force? So there's no subsequent policy other than dropping some weapons on them and talking about Kobane for a bit. I do not see, looking at the example from the Kurdistan region in Iraq, that this is going to dissipate and their expectations are going to become less. I only see it becoming more. So that's what I mean. And I don't see a political solution on the table.
I think we may like it or not, we should accept that the big majority of the Syrian refugees are not guests. They will stay in Turkey. They're not going to go anywhere. Their houses are burnt. Their families are everywhere, and they're not going to go back to Syria in the next 10, 15, 20 years. And most likely after that time period, they will prefer to stay in Turkey or they will emigrate to other countries. They will open their doors to them. And it seems like, I think at this point we should be ready or we should make plans on integrating them into the society. I'm not an expert on the subject, but I could think about a few options. I think Turkey should compartmentalize its foreign policy disagreements on ISIS or and other major issues with the Western world and the European Union and the United States, and agree that the United States and the European Union should be more active in building programs to integrate, the financial programs and more like development programs to help to integrate these people, especially the younger generation, to the society. I think teaching them Turkish is very important. Building like a long-term residential programs or the citizenship provision, I think is important. At this point, I think we should be realistic. Turkey opened its doors, it did the right thing. It was not able to build the long-term planning at the beginning, but now it's time to think about a longer-term strategy. Skills and education, I think is very important. Social security is important, but also Turkey has its own problems. So Turkey cannot do it itself. So it's impossible to do it itself at this point. So we need definitely support from the international community in integrating and accepting some of these people to their countries as well. I think the burden must be shared in order to provide good future for these refugees that created by the systemic failure, I would say.
Just very quickly on the refugee issue, the number of refugees in Turkey is about 2 million right now. Just to give you a sense of the context, Syria's pre-war population was 20 million. Half of that population has been displaced. This is the worst humanitarian disaster since World War II. 1 out of every 2 Syrians has lost their homes. Of that number, over half of that number are refugees outside of Syria, so about 40% are displaced inside the country, 60% are outside. And Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon host altogether about 90% of that refugee population, 3 neighboring countries. There are also larger numbers in Iraq, Egypt, and spreading across North Africa. Of the 2 million in Turkey, a majority are in southern Turkey. I think 1 million Gaziantep is a roundup. It's probably not that high. But there are about 5 Turkish provinces which border Syria where overwhelming percentage of the refugees are located. Part of that is because that's where the camps are, but the camps are hosting only about 10% of the refugee population. So the 90%, which is not in camps, is basically taking care of themselves. They are using NGOs, Turkish and international NGOs, for support, and the government has provided them with health care and access to education. So I think Turkey has done a commendable job in taking care of refugees with very little international support, spending not also a lot of money, but also providing for their care. But there are risks that the population poses. First, because of the fact that the refugees are concentrated mostly in southern Turkey. Though I think everybody in Turkey ultimately makes it to Istanbul because that's where opportunities are. In Turkish, there's a saying: "All the roads lead to Istanbul." I made it up.
You did?
But I did, yeah. But the population that is in southern Turkey is creating ethnic and demographic and economic pressures. First, they are competing for low-paying jobs. Second, they're pushing rents up. Third, they're changing the ethnic and sectarian balance of some of these provinces. Some of the provinces in southern Turkey had Arab populations before the war, ethnic Arab populations, Turkish citizens. With the addition of new Arabs, for example, some of them are about to become majority Arab for the first time. Hatay is probably on the cusp of becoming Turkey's first Arab majority province. On top of it, whereas before the war, most Arabs in Hatay were Alawite, most incoming Arabs are Sunnis, so they're tilting the sectarian balance and the ethnic balance at the same time. And the risk of it is that they're probably going to import, unfortunately, ethnic and sectarian tensions into the southern provinces where they're coming in, whether it's Alawite versus Sunni or Arab versus Kurd, and increasingly the threat of ISIS also looms. So there is a huge security risk for Turkey, and I think it ought to manage the further flows of refugees better. That's why I mentioned Aleppo in the beginning as a potential hotspot for Turkey saying, we can't do this anymore, meaning take more refugees. They have to stay on the other side, and the only way they can be done is through safe havens and no-fly zones.
Okay.
But I just add a footnote there. First, thank you very much for going to Gaziantep. My NGO works in southeast Turkey and also in northern Jordan, and I think it's very easy to analyze what is now wrong, and I think it's very easy to imagine what could even be worse. But the only thing that matters is what you actually are going to do. So since you asked me for a suggestion, education for these young people. They are not being educated. Turkey's doing a wonderful job providing the framework to sustain the life of these families, but these children need education. They need to emerge as people who can express themselves orally and in writing and persuasively, and not as victims of some situation 10 years from now. The second point is help the communities who are being impacted, as Sunair very eloquently explained, manage this. We did that job in northern Jordan. Our focus was not on the refugees, but on the communities being impacted. All those kids in school who have a different perspective, all those people who might be driving up rents, all those people who are setting up businesses when other people may be struggling. So those two things help the communities that are being impacted and educate the children. Thanks.
I see a lot of hands up. Unfortunately, we're out of time. So maybe we can continue discussion some other time. Maybe come up and talk to the panel, ask the panelists yourselves. But I'd like you to join me in thanking this panel for a wonderful and exciting discussion.